Good afternoon again. First of all, let me thank the Standing Committee on Finance for inviting the Africa Adaptation Initiative to give some of our thoughts. I put this slide at the back because I know many of you may not know what the Africa Adaptation Initiative. There is supposed to be a website there, but it's not very visible. But it's the Africa Adaptation Initiative.org. So essentially a little 1 second around what the Africa Adaptation Initiative. We have an African mandate from 54 heads of state from Africa to look at how we can enhance adaptation in the continent, adaptation action in the continent. So this came out after the realization that we still keep talking about adaptation, and with the Paris Agreement, we will still keep talking about adaptation in the negotiations, but as Dita said right now, the impacts are felt now. So the heads of state from 54 African countries urged us and the African ministers to develop this initiative that looks at how we can enhance adaptation action and support for the continent. Now, from the adaptation initiative, I suppose I could say, coming from the adaptation community, I have structured my intervention in 2 parts. One is what did I hear from the conversations, and what did I not hear from the conversations today? Because I came here with the expectation that we're going to talk about mobilizing climate finance. So what did I not hear? We heard a lot of things. I think for the past 2 days, we had discussions around what the countries are faced with in terms of the problems that the countries are faced with, in terms of the barriers. And today we went further to talk about some of the lessons we can learn. And I think that was really good. That was good in the sense that we were coming to some common understanding about what those really are, the barriers and the problems. But I think what is missing from this conversation, other than the issue that I'm going to talk about, is what about those institutions that are actually providing the finance, what kind of challenges they are faced with. So, institutions under the UNFCCC, what kind of challenges are they faced with regards to enhancing finance globally, I suppose, and adaptation in particular. So I structured what I did not hear into 7 very short key messages. The first is the Paris Agreement for us from the adaptation community was celebrated. It was celebrated in the sense that we are able to move from a very mitigation-centric focus to one that embraces adaptation. So for us, it was a real celebration. And I guess the challenge becomes how then that material parity is then reflected in all aspects of our work. So in finance, for example, how does that even begin to be reflected, the parity between the finance that goes to mitigation and the finance that goes to adaptation? I thought we were going to have some very concrete discussion around that. Looking at the GCF website, I'm going to cite just the GCF. I'm sorry, facilitators, I hope I'm not talking too fast. If I am, just let me know. I will reduce my speed. If you look at the GCF, adaptation is approximately funded 27%, others say 34%. So indeed, that balance is not maintained, and that's a real challenge for the adaptation community. How do we maintain that parity in terms of finance for adaptation and mitigation? The second thing that I didn't hear much about today and yesterday was around understanding the needs. We really talked about what are the problems, but what about the needs of developing countries? It's really important to understand what the needs are such that we're able to devise targeted intervention and targeted support for developing countries. The third aspect, which was mentioned, I think, towards the end, was about how climate change presents an additionality to development. This is true. It is happening now. It is a burden for our countries, and ensuring that infrastructure is resilient to the impacts of climate change is even more important. I mean, I'll give a real example of Botswana, where I'm from. Last year, we had the worst drought in 34 years. It affected the agriculture sector immensely, and it affected water immensely. We were actually going to level 5 water restrictions. 2 months after that, we had a cyclone. So the 1 minute government is dealing with drought, one extreme event. 2 months later, they're dealing with floods, one big extreme event that really affected the roads. So the impacts are there. They're urgent and immediate needs that we're faced with. I didn't get a conversation around how we deal with that. The fourth item that I think we need to have more discussion on is around direct access modalities. We didn't really get into some depth around that. If you look at the whole idea behind direct access modalities was to improve access. But at the same time, if you look at what the GCF is telling us on their website, I use the GCF website quite a lot, as you can see. Well done to GCF. It's very user-friendly. 16% of all funds go for direct access modalities, and you can correct me, GCF, if you're here, and 75 is international. So how do we address that imbalance? And we want to increase direct access modalities. The fifth item is around climate information and data. In order to understand the current and future impacts, we need reliable, good quality data that we can then use to inform decision making. Not only that, but to also support climate resilient infrastructure, policies that address or support climate resilient infrastructure. But in Africa, studies have been done, and it shows that 70% of our observational infrastructure is not working to the quality that the WMO, well, actually 1/8 of all observational infrastructure is not sufficient to provide decision makers with information. So we're looking at infrastructure that needs to be updated. Funding for this infrastructure is required, but we didn't get to talk about that climate information services that we need in order to have climate resilient infrastructure. The fourth thing I think was talked about just now by the ambassador of Fiji around fundable versus bankable. And there's a big difference there. I think the convention is very clear on Article 4 that adaptation should be supported, and as the Africa group, we feel that adaptation should be supported in the form of grants and not loans. So I think this is a really important key message that we need to keep. And then the seventh item is, there was a lot of talk around private sector investment and private sector involvement, but we also noted a lot of conversations were talking about how adaptation is not very attractive, particularly in even poorer countries where adaptation is considered a risk. So how do we provide in-country capacity and strengthen private sector entities for developing countries so that adaptation becomes a little bit more attractive? And what kind of incentives can we come with? And using existing institutions such as the GCF. The GCF has got a private sector facility. How can we use that to improve with regards to the involvement of the private sector? So those are the couple of key messages that I thought I could share. But in closing, what can the Standing Committee on Finance do? Looking at what we talked about yesterday was around the problems and the barriers at the national level, at a sub-national level, at a local level. How can we then use that wealth of information to design, to simplify access, means of access of finance? So how can the SCF, the Standing Committee of Finance, give guidance to the operating entities of the UNFCCC to simplify this means, given that the developing countries have got challenges with regards to accessing this finance? The second real concrete thing that I would like to make a recommendation to the SCF is the Secretariat, guided by the Standing Committee on Finance, could develop a report to provide an overview of the needs of developing countries for developing climate resilient infrastructure and opportunities for accessing support, drawing on the various lessons that we have learned of this afternoon. I think I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think that was a very useful summary of the perspective from the African group, which are shared by most of the developing countries. And I think that you already also brought up something that is absolutely necessary given the climate change impacts, is the urgency for us to act, and the urgency for us to understand. And I am sure that the members of the Standing Committee of Finance have heard you. We do have a very close interaction with the Adaptation Committee, for one thing. And of course, as you know, we are working. I'm looking forward to working with you therefore at the Conference of the Parties on this.